Y seguimos adelante. En esta ocasión con Michael Raspuzzi. Él viene de Harvard, de la universidad, trabaja en la intersección del diseño, la tecnología y el emprendimiento, centrándose en la innovación dentro del sistema global de alimentación y de la pedagogía multidisciplinar. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for being here. It's an honor. Michael, whenever you want.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Basque Culinary Center for hosting this wonderful event. Thank you to Juan David and Diego for the invitation, and thank you for the warm welcome. And so today I'll be sharing with you a little bit about my background and how I got to be where I am in terms of working on culinary labs. We've misspelled it purposely with an AI in the middle because we're using data and algorithms to personalize flavor and nutrition. And I thought I'd go through today an honest trajectory of what it's like on the ground as an early stage entrepreneur, constantly experimenting and learning along the way. And so there are three different parts to my talk. The first is my background. I'm a very unique, kind of constantly innovating in university settings, how that shapes my own perspective. Two, how we started cooking with algorithms, what kind of experiments we're testing out and trying just out of our kitchen, and then where we're at right now. And so to start, I actually started in the design field. My undergraduate was in architecture at Cornell. And I was spending my days in a studio environment drawing and imagining urban solutions to different problems. So a wonderful way to begin to tackle problems, but one which was focused on space building. And so I spent a lot of my time in undergrad figuring out how I could apply design elsewhere in other settings. And the narrative I'll be giving is one which looks backwards, where again, I think some of the speakers have mentioned, it's easier to connect the dots backward than looking forward. And so the caveat to what I'm about to tell you is, went through 38 different projects, 8 different prototypes, 4 failed startups and multiple research projects, and that led with one successful nonprofit and a passion for cooking, which was, I consider, a success. And the biggest thing coming out of Cornell was knowing where I sat. I sat very much at the intersection of design, engineering, and entrepreneurship. So I was doing research in the engineering school on sustainable materials. I was helping teach entrepreneurship. And so for me, it was really important to keep that center in the middle. And so my first startup endeavor, outside of just prototyping products, was actually managing the innovation pipeline for Cornell. There was a gap between the classes that were offered for students during the semester and the kind of work students wanted to be doing in the summer to continue to grow their products and get it into market. So I started a summer incubator program, bringing together local entrepreneurs and alumni, helping MBAs, JDs, PhDs commercialize their technology and figuring out what that tune of innovation was, especially after graduation. While that was great for summer opportunities, to sustain that during the year, we hosted continued community events for the entire campus. And one of the first things they helped found was there was a lot of hackathons at the time, using software and data as a way to design products. We started Cornell's first Makeathon. So it was about physically building prototypes you could see. And actually last year we hosted one on the future of food. The third thing connected to this nonprofit and supporting innovation for the university was actually a high school boot camp. We were questioning how could we take everything we had learned through all this programming and package it into 2 weeks to help high school students learn the basics of entrepreneurship and computer programming to test products very quickly. And it's amazing what you can do under constraints. In less than 2 weeks, the high school students had work that was just as impressive as the university students. During my 5th year, as I was supposed to be completing my architectural thesis, I got distracted in a side passion project. My twin sister went to culinary school, she started baking, and we ran a pop-up confectionery. Our kitchen was filled with thousands of truffles, and very quickly learned what it takes to begin to package and sell something and communicate, even before we had the product, how do we get people excited? And this was my first experiment with flavors and designing custom blends within the chocolates, and it was very much a collaborative effort between her craft and the design of different flavors. So that's my academic pursuit, professional pursuit, and personally got very much interested in the power of food to bring people together. So the caveat is I'm not a professional chef, but I am an amateur chef who's continually cooking, again, for that power of community. And so this is a photo of the last event we ran at Cornell. It was for over 30 people. We did a 5-course meal, and it was actually a murder mystery. We We murdered the host, and we had all these games and puzzles around food. And one of the most amazing powers of bringing together people over food is it doesn't matter where you're coming from or what you're bringing to the dinner. Everyone can enjoy the meal. So in this photo, you have undergrads next to master's students, next to postdoc researchers, even next to community members. And so this formed the foundation for my next steps. These are the three main takeaways. One, in terms of how I approach innovations, it's intersectional. It's constantly going across different disciplines. I see startups and entrepreneurship as the means to make that happen, and I had slowly developed a passion for food. And if you asked me at this moment how that would all transform and develop, I wouldn't be able to tell you. It's constantly learning and moving forward. At this time, this was 2016, there was a bunch of new graduate programs and opportunities popping up in the US that were really looking at what's the future of education and how do you begin to support innovation at that earliest step with the university as a living laboratory. And so I got accepted into the new Master of Design Engineering program at Harvard. It sits half in the architecture school and half in the engineering school, and it's really cultivating individuals like myself who see both sides and not only want to theorize and idealize what the future is, but actually build it out. We're responsible within yearly sprints of building out technology and putting it into the market, whatever that may be. And the work is really much focused on the center of society, impact, technology, and the environment. And one of the most interesting things, at least around this graduate school approach, is usually go back to graduate school to become a specialist. You pick a specific trajectory and learn more and more and more. This is very much a master's program, and being a generalist. It's centered across the entire university, and students have the opportunity of taking electives across the law school, the business school, the School of Public Policy, and even the School of Medicine, which very much shapes, again, some of the work I'm about to share with you. And so, again, the honest caveat is going through this. Wouldn't know how the dots would connect looking back, but worked on over a dozen projects in 2 years. Helped start teaching innovation classes. As a master's student, helped teach over 8 different classes, some which were brand new to Harvard. Had 3 failed startups along the way. I think the more and more you build out, the harder it is to fail. Different research jobs, and out of that, 1 startup, which I'm working on right now. And so to start off, my approach to graduate school was actually looking at the production side of food. We really started looking at the farmer. What problems does the farmer face in the 21st century, and how can technology begin to empower them? And one of the biggest things we learned from talking with farmers was how disconnected they are from the rest of the decision makers in the food system. You have agribusinessmen, environmentalists, even consumers making decisions on what happens in the market. And the farmers are the only ones who are cultivating the land and taking that risk financially, personally, and even as practitioners, growing crops seasonally. And so we prototyped a data-driven solution in central India. I was working with a colleague from Bhopal at the time, and what we did was we aggregated all of the different metrics that the different stakeholders use to make decisions. So what kinds of things were people using to make policy decisions or decisions in markets? And the hypothesis was if the farmer could tell at the beginning of the season what was happening regionally, they could make smarter decisions. And this was the biggest learning from this prototype and working with the farmers was realizing how human-centered it needs to be in terms of approaching innovation. You need to consider the experience side and who's ultimately using and how can it benefit them. So we started and ended the prototyping session talking, listening to the farmers, and deployed that in a way which helped out. And another caveat to this program is you start spinning out projects that could be entire decades worth of pursuing. And so we prototyped this in under 10 months with people who didn't have an economist background or understanding much about the agricultural system, but we could begin to develop that for these stakeholders in particular. And that project was successful enough, we were awarded an innovation grant from Harvard, where we took what we learned in farming and sourcing and applied that to sustainable seafood. And the proposal on paper sounded really good. We just would adopt the framework and helped Harvard source more sustainable seafood. But as many of you probably know in the industry, seafood is not the same thing. The metrics are a lot messier. In the US, we have a lot of different organizations trying to understand what sustainable seafood sourcing is, but they don't line up. So while we could apply the approach that we used for farming. The end result was a little bit different. We mapped out all of the different species of fish which was coming into Boston. Harvard's biggest constraint is they need to feed thousands of students, and so the best thing we could do for them was give them an update every year of what kind of species were coming in and how they could diversify their own purchasing portfolio of fish to be more sustainable, again, with an adaptive mindset of what sustainability was. And the biggest challenge for this project was not actually on the sourcing side, but actually on the user side. Harvard Dining Services were feeding students, and students are very picky. So when there's a new kind of species of fish on the menu, students don't eat it, and if students don't eat it, the university doesn't invest in it. And so we really started looking at unique ways of describing different sourced fish. So for those who didn't necessarily care about the sustainability of it, we could talk about it in ways that were more relatable. So beginning to abstract specific species and expectations into things like mouthfeel or texture or things that were interchangeable in the recipes. And so that was my entire first year in graduate school, looking at sustainable sourcing and production of food. My second year was really looking at the consumer side, and more so on the healthcare. What started as a 3-month exploration in the personalized microbiome space, we had hypotheses for therapeutic development, and we were using the Harvard Innovation Lab's new wet lab space to begin to prototype these things. Again, got into the trouble of a timing difference. These hypotheses would take probably a 6 to 7 year PhD, and I had about 6 months before I needed to turn in my master's thesis. So we adopted that work in the personalized microbiome space into a healthcare coach for new moms in the US. And new moms in the US are most at risk at becoming overweight or obese after childbirth if they don't lose the weight. In the US, there's a big gap for support for new moms. As soon as the baby is born, all of the medical attention is put on the newborn, and the new mom is left out. And so we were using machine learning to begin to aggregate different anecdotes and different stories outside of the clinic. So when a new mom had a question in terms of, is this normal? How do I respond to this? Both for themselves and for the baby, they could begin to use these personal recommendations to overcome anecdotes. And the biggest thing is we weren't interrupting mother's intuition. If you had to go to the hospital to check in something, you would still go to the clinic. But one of the biggest things from testing the initial prototypes for this thesis was the removal of bias in healthcare. New moms constantly felt judged in professional care settings, and being able to talk to using a chatbot interface to begin to ask these questions, they felt that they could get answers without being judged. So we won the thesis prize for this, and this was really my first foray into food, health, and managing different stakeholders in healthcare to innovate in food. So alongside that academic pursuit and all those prototypes, this is a picture of my living room. More intentionally, going into graduate school was cooking weekly pop-up dinners, because my goal was to really connect with the entire, not only graduate school community, but also the entire city. How do we begin to connect with local entrepreneurs, community leaders, nonprofit leaders, and even people in my own neighborhood? And dinner is one thing where everyone has to come together. So we branded it as the 14th unsanctioned house at Harvard. Harvard has a unique housing system for the undergrads, but the graduate students are a little bit less supported. And the most interesting thing was by constructing this narrative and hosting our mission, we were actually able to get funding for a lot of the events. And each event was themed. Sometimes it was themed around food, sometimes it was themed around the discussion and debates that were had. And here I'll go through a few examples of some of the dinners, but one of the first things we were questioning was identity, community, and belonging. And so this was a dinner called A Spoonful of Culture. You have graduate students from around the world coming in. They make one dish, so it's a creative take on the potluck dinner, and they serve one bite of that dish on an amuse-bouche spoon. So we had over 11 courses with 11 different cultures represented, and a really interesting conversation on what it means to be a local and global population in Boston. Sometimes following the dinners, we'd have pop-ups with music. This is the Global Music Ensemble taking on Ukrainian folk music and dance after a dinner. This is a picture from a literature intersection. We were hosting different book clubs, and we're using, for any Tolkien fans in the rooms, we were using Lord of the Ring to recreate different events that were actually happening in the books. And Salvador Dali's cookbook was republished last year by Taschen Publisher, so we also did a surrealist art dinner and the likes. And so this was a combination, which was a weekly practice for me as a designer who really cared about food, not only in terms of serving and building community, but also exploring flavor, taste, what it means cross-culturally, but also what it means in a creative sense. And this was actually the backdrop where we started cooking with algorithms, which I'll get through next. So the biggest takeaways I had from all of these different projects was one, working in food and innovating in food is inherently a systems problem. Food means many different things to many different people. For some, it's livelihood. For others, it's entertainment, it's health, it's survival. And so in order to truly innovate in food, you have to collaborate across the different stakeholders and what they imagine food to be. And then the third thing that's important is the impact. Technology often can be seen as utilitarian and very rational, and we often forget that on the other side of that, there are people and their experiences that we also have to design for. And so now I'll go through the experiments that we're cooking with, which started, incidentally, just as a theme of one of the dinners, and it very quickly evolved into what we're working on today. And so just to begin, I want to go over some very basic terms. I think one of the biggest things when you're collaborating across disciplines is defining the terms for different audiences. And so the biggest thing we're working through is the uncertainty. And we're still probably right in the middle of uncertainty and focus because we're still iterating and experimenting. But going through this process and really figuring out your hypotheses to test them is a convergent and divergent process. You imagine things, begin to frame things, test them, and again, constantly iterate based off of what you learn. And so in terms of rapid prototyping, in the design sense, you make something, you deploy it and test it with that specific user or specific experience, you measure, and you take what you learned and apply that again. It's very cyclical. And one of the biggest tools as designers is our optimism and imagination for what could be ahead. And so in terms of how we framed our hypotheses, while we were looking at different things in the applied science realm, we were using how might we questions as ways to frame what we were about to test. And so every single algorithm and meal that I'll go through, I'll frame it as a how might we question to highlight both what we learned in the failures and successes. And this is a relentless process. I think these diagrams are really fun to look at, and they begin to explain some of the complexity that's happening, but it's constant. And so again, we are, even right now as I speak, we're still in the middle of iterating on different prototypes. And so the first question we asked ourselves was, how might we be more creative in the kitchen using data and algorithms? And this was actually framed as a bet. I lost this bet with my co-founder, Manu. She's actually coming from the MIT Media Lab and the Open Ag Institute. And the premise of this meal was, could we begin to use data to make a dish that would make us both happy? Manu's a vegetarian who doesn't like vegetables, which makes for a very peculiar kind of diet. And because I'd been cooking and exploring different recipes, I also had my own ideas of what good food was, especially when serving it to others. And so the first model we made was a global fusion food model. On one hand, we were looking at quantifying a very qualitative aspect of food. How do you begin to understand something like culture? And on the other hand, that was the quickest way we could prototype our own preferences. Manu, coming from southern India, it wasn't that she didn't like vegetables, it's like she liked food in a very specific way. It had a specific texture, specific flavoring, and even specific ingredient combinations. And I have roots in northern Italy, which again has a very specific practice around food. So these models did two things. One, it aggregated which ingredients made up which regional cuisines, and the second thing was a frequency analysis of which ingredients go together. So the output of this was actually very much like an Iron Chef interpretive string of ingredients. They had to figure out how to cook. And after 3 weeks, we had over 1,000 ingredients that were very much around our parameters of the intersection of Indian and Italian food. So the first dish we cooked was a cilantro jalapeno pesto. And the most interesting thing was, one, this was something that was counterintuitive to what we had imagined going into this experiment. We couldn't have come up with this without aggregating the data and being more methodological in terms of approaching this dish. But the second thing in terms of flavor, it was delicious. Cilantro is more buttery than basil when you crush it up, and using the jalapeno, you can actually vary the amounts to make it very spicy, or just to add a little bit of flavor and kick to that bitterness. So because this worked. We had a dish that we both ate, and we tested all of these things in roundtable dinners. We took feedback and surveys. Everyone agreed that it was tasty. We kept cooking and kept evolving how we could cook with algorithms. And so the second question we had was, how might we be more creative with our inputs in the kitchen, specifically looking around ways you begin to think about ingredients. And at that time, we were approaching the New England fall. Fall in itself has different connotations in flavor because of natural systems in terms of preservation and spices, and also market trends, the pumpkin spice latte, etc. But in terms of being creative, we were just looking at one facet of creativity. What if we could take the different colors from that you would expect in the changing of the leaves, reds, yellows, maroons. What if we could take those and begin to design a meal just based off of those hex codes? So we tried to model understanding different images, different ingredient colors, and you could give it whatever hex code you want, and you'd get the ingredients to cook with. And so we got just exactly what we wanted, a dish that looked exactly like you would a New England fall photo. Very interesting. You have a chocolate carrot puree, you have mashed sweet potatoes, radicchio, a spiced eggplant, and so visually stunning. Everyone, the first thing they did was take photos of this dish, and they liked the story and began to eat it. But objectively, this was the worst tasting dish I had ever served anybody, and we couldn't blame the algorithms for that because we didn't train it on flavor. But the most interesting bias that happened from this meal was nobody complained. And then we began really diving into perception biases and the psychology behind what makes a good meal, because what should have been a bunch of angry dinner guests were people who very much were delighted in trying this. And so we very quickly moved past just creative inputs and began asking ourselves, how might we understand flavor so that we can begin to use different ways to approach food as we were cooking already, but in a way that we wouldn't end up with another dish like that. And so started doing low-fidelity prototypes. We actually started doing blindfolded dinners. Guests couldn't see what they were about to eat, and also we blocked the olfactory sense and the nose so that you could only take a bite and register what you would begin to taste. So our goal, there are thousands of variables to control for in terms of like how someone responds to flavor, but we were beginning to peel back those perception biases just to understand initial reaction to taste. And so we ran a test in terms of the theme of the dinner was, this was the time I was doing the seafood research, so the theme of the dinner was canned tuna. We had guests who had told us beforehand and filled out a survey that said they didn't like fish. And our goal was to begin to use the algorithms to begin to interpret the ingredient, canned tuna, in such a way that was more palatable. So how could we begin to muddle that salty and sea-forward taste of tuna? And we also did a sleight of hand in our taste test. So on one hand, we had like a mustard tartare. Mustard is tangy and sour, so you couldn't really taste the fish. We did a Portuguese bacalhau pie, used potatoes to, again, muddle that flavor. But on the other hand, every single bite we had with tuna, we also served something with salted boiled cabbage. And boiled cabbage is molecularly the most closest thing to canned tuna. And we were testing with our guests who were now blindfolded and had no idea what they were stepping into outside of an event centered around seafood and data. We wanted to see what their responses were to both these recipes that were supposed to change the profile of fish, but also these dishes that clearly didn't have fish. And for more than half of the guests, they couldn't actually tell the difference. And while there was a very clear texture difference between salted cabbage and canned tuna, flavor-wise, it was similar. Aromatically, our kitchened boiled cabbage smelled exactly like the tuna dishes we were cooking. But at this point, again, one layer deeper in terms of understanding just how amateur we are at tastes and understanding flavor perception. And so the other thing we had from the result of this dinner was the varied responses in terms of how people liked or didn't like that experience. For some people, the texture was the driving force in terms of the reason they liked or didn't like their bites. For others, it was the flavor. So our next questions were around how can we begin to personalize these flavors to individuals. And we started doing, this was after graduation, so we started working full-time, doing R&D and prototyping, and really understanding the science behind how we we sense flavor. And so one of the first things we did was go back into our flavor algorithms to understand not only which ingredients went together, but why. This was a coconut, cinnamon, watermelon slushie. One of the things in terms of controlling variables, our first tests were with soups, smoothies, and drinks. We were looking at things we could control the temperature and texture of, so we could really just look at flavor combination. Alongside basic ingredient combinations with data, we were looking at being able to take a product off the shelf. This is an Ecuadorian tea that's in Boston right now. If we could begin to take flavor notes from a specific ingredient and reverse engineer a recipe, what would that look like? And our first hypotheses in the middle of last summer were that we could go back to the user and ask them what they like or didn't like. So we continued these blind taste testings. We were using the napping technique to understand variation in flavor. And we hit a point where people we were asking feedback for ran into flavor fatigue. Our palate is very sensitive, and the more and more you try something, the more confused you can get in terms of the nuanced differences. So we actually, in terms of asking someone what they like, we hit a wall in terms of being able to make those decisions for them because we don't, our palates are really intricate. And so by the end of the summer, we were setting up full pop-up experiences now. These were no longer small-scale dinners. These were large pop-ups in Boston. We had customers paying $25 and waiting over an hour in line just to get that one bite and that one dish designed for their palate. As entrepreneurs, designers, and scientists, we're not in the hospitality space, so learned a lot of things in terms of setting that up. But the most interesting thing we were testing was could we predict what people would like in terms of a flavor experience? And we used a bunch of different inputs. One, general food preferences and background, how you relate to the food that you like. We were looking at multimodal sense inputs, both in terms of taste and smell to rapid prototype where your palate might be and what mood you might be in for the night. And we only served people one serving. If you didn't like that, we had an open return policy. You could return it back. We'd send our compliments back to the algorithmic chef. We wouldn't take it personally. And we had a success rate of over 90% in that predictive rate for this first time. And the worst part of the experience was actually the reverse tasting. So after you got your personalized bite designed for you, we gave you a sample of every single person at your table so we could confirm our own recursion bias in terms of how variable flavor had to be. We actually designed custom recipes for every single person who walked in. We had over 200 people in 3 nights. We set up a modular kitchen for that. And the feedback we got from our guests was that the reverse tasting was the worst part of the experience. Usually a tasting helps you get closer and closer to where your palate is and what you like, and by doing the opposite and showing how variable flavor was, we actually had to change this by our 3rd night of service into clustering specific flights based off of what you would like, because again, we got the feedback that people didn't think this was worth it. And so that's I just walked through 6 months of constant R&D and iterating in terms of how data and algorithms can begin to personalize flavor, what that means on the service side, what that means psychologically for the user, and where our value is. And right now, we're a mission-driven startup where we're looking to combine our insights and personalized flavor and apply that in the nutrition space. And so, again, very much I'm still operating at the intersection of multiple fields, wearing multiple hats in between data and machine learning, nutritional science, and the culinary arts. And each one of these has a different core value, which is important ultimately for the user experience. And so now, in terms of the first test we did this year, we did a public demo at MIT Media Lab, and we were asking how might we help others be more creative in sustaining healthy behaviors by personalized flavor and nutrition. And so 90% of Americans don't eat their daily servings of fruits and vegetables. So there are a lot of people like Manu who are avoiding that on their plate. And we began looking into why that was and what different ingredients were. And this is a picture of Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are the most hated vegetable in America. There are multiple surveys and very interesting studies done on why that is. But as a member of the brassica family and the mustard seed family, Brussels sprouts have a natural sulfuric compound that comes out when you overcook them. The texture becomes very mushy, so a lot of people's perception of this ingredient is that of a school-time cafeteria or fighting in a home environment with the last thing on their plate. And so our questions going into this was, could we begin to use personalized flavor to design recipes to make Brussels sprouts not a hated side dish, but a desired main dish? So we cooked 7 different forms of Brussels sprouts, changing the texture from crispy to fermented and soft in a coleslaw to shredded in a soup where you couldn't even see it. And we walked away with this event understanding where different people were coming in terms of their expectations and how we could help empower them afterwards by telling them something about their palate and translating that to a recipe they may like. So this is an example of one of my favorites. It's a smoky chipotle Brussels sprout. It's sweet and smoky. And so right now, what we're doing is we're looking at how do we package all of this into a single platform and product, and our goal is ultimately to help cancer patients. Because 50 to 80% of cancer patients experience taste change during chemotherapy, and if you asked a doctor 10 years ago, they would tell you that you lose your sensation of taste. Because chemotherapy targets all of the cells in your body that regenerate, and your taste cells are one that regenerates the quickest. And so while it's different for every person, we can begin to use our technology that maps out baseline profiles and help chemotherapy patients understand where they're at, because it's a point of just eating and maintaining nutrition. It's not even a point of eating more healthy in some instances. And so right now, actually this week, we're getting ready to ship our next iteration of this product and our first experiment in personalized spices. We've trained a database based off of different flavor notes and different combinations. We can combine custom blends for individuals as it's based on different ingredients. We also can recommend different spices to individual needs. And so our mission and vision for the future is how do we begin to bring hospitality back into the hospital and the healthcare system, working at this intersection of innovation. I think one of the projects we really appreciate from the Basque Culinary Center is Project Gastronomía. We're talking about the role of the chef moving forward, and our vision for that role of the chef is one that's integrated with clinical nutritionists, doctors, sensory scientists, and others to begin to help people make better decisions around healthy eating. Thank you so much.